Thursday nights had a rhythm to them. 2 hours in a church gym. The same guys, the same floor, the same squeak of sneakers cutting hard across hardwood. David Cam drove home with tired legs and a quiet mind. Windows down. September air moving through the cab of his car like it had somewhere to be. He was already thinking about dinner, about checking on the kids before bed, about the particular kind of peace that comes from doing something simple and doing it well. He turned onto Lockhart Road, the street that carried his own family name, and pressed the remote on his visor. The garage door began to rise. That slow familiar grind he had heard 1,000 times before. Metal rolling on metal. The sound of coming home. The door was halfway up when he saw her feet. He did not understand what he was looking at. Not yet. Not in those first seconds. The door kept moving and with every inch more of her came into view. Her legs. Her body. And then Kim herself, lying completely still on that concrete floor in a way that no person should ever be still. His foot hit the brake. The car stopped at an angle, half in and half out of the driveway. He was out before it fully stopped, moving across that garage in 3 steps, dropping to his knees beside her. He grabbed her face in both hands. He said her name. Then louder. Then again. There was a stillness to her that reached inside him and broke something he did not know could break. Her eyes were open. He looked into them. And somewhere in that moment, in the space between one breath and the next, he understood something that no husband should ever have to understand. But the kids. Where were the kids? He turned to the Bronco. The passenger door was open. He looked through the window into the back seat and the air left his body completely. Jill was sitting upright in her car seat, still buckled. She was 5 years old. She had never even gotten the chance to undo the clasp. She had not moved when the car stopped. Had not stirred when her father screamed. Then he saw Bradley. 7 years old. Draped over the back of the seat at an angle that said everything, like he had tried to climb forward, tried to get away from something terrible, and had not made it. David reached in and touched his son. Warm. That single detail cracked something open inside him because warm means possibility. Warm means maybe. Warm means you have to try. He pulled Bradley out of the Bronco and laid him down on that cold concrete floor right next to his wife's body and pressed his hands to his son's chest and he pushed. He tilted his boy's head back and breathed into his mouth. Pushed again. Breathed again. His own breath going into lungs that no longer knew how to use it. Bradley did not come back. The warmth was only the last memory of a life that had already left. David ran inside. He grabbed the phone. He called the Indiana State Police, his former workplace, the people he had worked beside for a decade. Get everybody out here to my house now. My wife and my kids are dead. He hung up. He ran across the street to his grandfather's house and pounded on the door, screaming for someone, anyone to help him. His uncle ran back to the garage and found David trying desperately to get back to his family. He wrapped both arms around him and held on. Police arrived at 9:30 that night. What they found was a crime scene that raised more questions than it answered. No forced entry anywhere on the property. Nothing stolen. The killer had never entered the house. This was targeted, timed, and contained entirely within that garage. The attack happened there and only there, and then whoever did this had simply walked away into the warm September dark like they had somewhere else to be. But there was one detail that stopped every officer cold the moment they saw it. Kim's shoes. Both of them had been placed on top of the Bronco. Not thrown. Not knocked loose during a struggle. Placed there. Side by side. Toes pointing outward. Neat and deliberate, like someone had taken a careful moment in the middle of 3 murders to arrange them just so. Think about what that means. 3 people had just been shot to death. A woman was lying on a garage floor. 2 children were in a car. And somewhere inside all of that violence, someone had paused. Had bent down. Had lifted those shoes with intention and set them gently on the roof of that vehicle with what could only be described as care. What kind of person does that? That question had no answer on the night of September 28, 2000. It would take 5 years, a prison sweatshirt, and a DNA database to finally explain it. And the explanation, when it finally came, would expose something far darker than a single murder. It would expose a system that had been lying to itself for half a decade while a real predator walked freely through the world and a grieving father sat in a prison cell paying for a crime he did not commit. Before any of that, there was just a family. A real family on a quiet street in Georgetown, Indiana. David Cam and Kimberly Wren both grew up in New Albany, a small town where everybody knows everybody and everybody knows your business before you do. They met in the mid-1980s. Kim's sister said Kim had always wanted something solid, something real. When she met David, she believed she had found it. He was handsome, hard-working, the kind of man who showed up. They married in May of 1989 and almost immediately life began moving fast. That same year David joined the Indiana State Police and he did not simply blend in. He earned his way onto the Emergency Response Unit, the team that handled the calls nobody else wanted, the situations that made other officers hesitate. He received the department's Medal of Valor, not for a routine stop, but for jumping into a dangerous situation to try to save a drowning stranger at the risk of his own life. His colleagues said he was the most upstanding person you could ever imagine. Loyal. Honest. Trustworthy to his core. That was the version of David Cam that everyone could see. The other version was harder to spot. In 1992 Kim got pregnant with Bradley. He was born in 1993. And somewhere in that same window, while she was building their home and raising their son and trusting her husband completely, David walked into a gym and met a woman named Stephanie. He did not hide it well. He was seen taking her to restaurants, to races, openly, as if Kim and the children simply did not exist when he stepped outside that front door. Kim found out when she was 5 months pregnant with their second child. Think about that for a moment. She was carrying his baby and he sat across from her and told her he wanted a divorce. Then he packed his things and moved in with Stephanie. Even his own family, his parents, his siblings, refused to stand by him. They stayed with Kim. They showed up for her. His own blood chose her over him. That tells you everything about how wrong what he did was. Jill was born on February 28, 1995. David was not in that hospital room. A few months later the relationship with Stephanie ended and David came back. Said he had changed. Said he wanted his family. Kim let him come home. What followed looked from the outside like a genuine second chance. They did not simply occupy the same house and tolerate each other. They made a deliberate decision to start over. They began building a new home on Lockhart Road, the street that carried his family name, meant to be their sanctuary, their proof that the worst was finally behind them. But the old habits had already returned underneath the surface. By 1997 David had begun seeing another woman. Then another. Then more. Over the course of his marriage, investigators would eventually identify 12 separate affairs and inappropriate relationships he kept carefully hidden from the woman sleeping beside him every night. Here is the thing about David Cam that makes this case so difficult to sit with. On one side of the ledger you have a man who earned a Medal of Valor, who was beloved by colleagues, who his children adored, who Kim herself chose to forgive and rebuild with. On the other side you have a man living a double life so thoroughly that 12 women had stories about him and his own wife had no idea. Both of those men were real. And that is exactly what made him so dangerous to put on trial. Because a jury that hated him for his affairs might stop asking whether he was actually a murderer. That is a very important distinction, and it is one the prosecution would exploit without hesitation. By the year 2000 the surface looked better than it ever had. David had left the police in May, 4 months before the murders. He had joined his uncle Sam Lockhart's waterproofing business as a salesman and in 6 months was making double what the force had ever paid him. More money. More time at home. More presence. Kim was thriving as a senior accountant at a major insurance firm in Louisville. She was also the treasurer of their church, the Georgetown Community Church, the same church where David played basketball every Thursday night. Bradley was 7. Jill was 5. Both in school. Both happy. Kim's sister said it plainly. Kim finally had her white picket fence. But Kim herself had told something different to a close friend not long before she died. She had said that things felt like history was repeating itself. She did not explain what she meant. She did not need to. Her friend understood immediately. Kim had noticed something. A familiar distance. A familiar pattern. The same feeling she had learned to recognize once before. She had survived it the first time and rebuilt from the rubble of it. She was beginning to wonder if it was all happening again. She never got the chance to find out. On the morning of September 28, 2000, the Cam family woke up like any other Thursday. David kissed Kim and the kids goodbye and went to work. Kim dropped the children at school. Jill went to dance practice. Bradley went to swimming. Ordinary hours moving in their ordinary way. That evening Kim strapped both children into the back seat of the Bronco and headed home. 11 miles. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Just a mother bringing her kids home on a school night. When she pulled into that garage she saw the same familiar walls, the same shadows, the same home she had fought so hard to build and keep and believe in. She had no idea someone was already waiting in that darkness. The first officers through that garage door knew David Cam personally. Not professionally. Personally. These were men he had eaten lunch with, trained beside, trusted with his life for a decade. Detective Sean Clemens, one of the first on scene, was one of David's closest friends. David looked at these men the way a drowning person looks at a lifeboat. He was hysterical, shaking, barely holding himself together. He needed his brothers to step in and find whoever did this to his family. But the men looking back at him were not seeing a grieving husband. They were looking at a specimen under a microscope. The crime scene raised questions from the very first minute. No forced entry anywhere on the property, pointing immediately to someone who did not need a key or someone the family already knew. Nothing stolen. The killer had never entered the house. This was targeted, timed, and contained entirely within that garage. But it was the physical evidence that puzzled investigators most. The blood trail from Kim's body had an uneven color, darker in some places, almost diluted in others. One investigator thought it looked disturbed. Detective Sarkeesian, who would become lead investigator on the case, said it plainly. The crime scene looked off. It looked like it had been cleaned. A mop and bucket were found inside the house. Bleach stains on the back deck. And the blood around Kim's body was completely still. Undisturbed. David had said he rushed to her, dropped to his knees, grabbed her face, pulled Bradley from the back seat, laid him on the garage floor, performed CPR. All of that, every bit of it, would normally leave marks. Knee impressions. Drag patterns. Disturbance in the blood. Footprints. There were none. Sarkeesian could not let it go. If David really did all of that, where were the marks? Why was the blood so still? Why did the scene look like it had been staged rather than stumbled upon? He had a point. And for 3 days that point drove everything. Then came Robert Stites. Prosecutor Stan Faith had originally called in a blood spatter specialist named Rod Engert. Engert was unavailable and sent someone in his place. His assistant. His crime scene photographer. A man named Robert Stites who had never independently processed a murder scene in his life. Stites examined David's basketball shirt and found 8 microscopic drops of blood, each about a millimeter wide, all clustered in one corner of the fabric. Then he did something that should never happen in a murder investigation. He picked up the phone, described the stains verbally to Engert, and Engert reportedly confirmed the reading over the phone. No photographs. No in-person analysis. No documentation that could withstand scrutiny. Just a phone call between 2 men, one of whom was not even present at the scene. Stites declared the drops to be high-velocity impact spatter, the kind that only appears when a bullet strikes a body at close range, sending microscopic particles outward in every direction. His conclusion was precise and devastating. David Cam had been standing within 4 feet of someone when they were shot. 8 dots. A phone call. No formal training. That became the backbone of the probable cause affidavit that sent David to prison. What nobody mentioned, what prosecutors knew and deliberately buried, was that Robert Stites had no qualifications whatsoever. No degree in blood spatter analysis. No formal training of any kind. He was not an expert. He was a photographer who had been handed a crime scene and told to make it mean something. His credentials were entirely fabricated from the beginning. That truth would stay hidden for years while an innocent man's life collapsed entirely around it. A neighbor had also reported hearing 3 sharp sounds coming from the direction of the Cam house after 9 in the evening on the night of the murders. 3 cracks in the night. Sharp. Distinct. But here is the question nobody asked at the time. Was she hearing the end of a family or the beginning of a frame? On October 1st, just 3 days after David found his family, investigators brought him in for formal questioning. The same men who had once been his brothers sat across a table from him and laid out what they believed. They showed him the blood on his shirt. They told him what Stites had concluded. They told him about the neighbor's report. They pointed to the absence of marks in the blood. They told him the timeline placed the murders after he had returned home. David's response was not composed. It was not rehearsed. It was fury and grief colliding in real time. I cannot believe this. You are going to try to blame me for killing my children. He pushed back on every point. The neighbor was confused about the time. The blood on his shirt came from leaning over Jill to reach Bradley. He had nothing to do with any of this. Then the investigators revealed the piece they had been holding back. Jill's autopsy had found something dark, something the medical examiner had flagged immediately, evidence of a deeply sinister and personal violation against a 5-year-old child. David did not just cry. He crumbled. It was the sound of a man losing the very last piece of his soul. Through tears, through visible devastation, he said, "This is my 5-year-old daughter. I had nothing to do with this. I loved my daughter." The investigators did not move. There was one thing David had that should have stopped everything cold. 11 witnesses. 11 people, including his uncle Sam Lockhart and a respected church elder named Tom Jolly, all prepared to say under oath that David Cam had been in that gym the entire evening. He played 2 of the 3 games. He sat on the baseline during the second game. He had a full conversation with Tom Jolly throughout the night. He never left. He never disappeared. He never came back acting strange or distracted or different in any way. 11 witnesses is not a thin alibi. It is a wall. A wall built from consistent, unwavering, corroborated human testimony that had not changed a single detail across repeated questioning. But investigators had already decided the wall was made of liars. Either these men were covering for David or they had gotten so caught up in the game that they missed a 15-minute window. That was their theory. That is what they chose to believe over 11 people telling the same story. On October 1, 2000, 72 hours after David found his family in that garage, he was handcuffed and charged with 3 counts of murder. And while David was being fingerprinted and processed, the real answer to this entire case was already sitting in an evidence locker 2 floors away. A single gray sweatshirt. A single strand of DNA from an unknown male. Right there. Waiting. Patient and silent in a cardboard box while the police, who were supposed to find the truth, had already decided they had. They were not looking for the truth anymore. They were looking for a conviction. The trial began on January 14, 2002 in Floyd County, Indiana. By that point David Camm had already been convicted in the court of public opinion. The headlines had done their work long before any jury sat down in New Albany. He was not David Camm anymore. He was the monster from Lockhart Road. The cop who killed his own family. The man with the stained clothing. The cameras were everywhere. Every detail of his marriage, his affairs, his failures as a husband fed to a hungry news cycle that had no interest in complexity. The story was simple. Bad husband kills family. And simple stories sell. Inside that courtroom the prosecution had a problem. Their actual physical evidence was thin. 1 shirt. 8 drops. A neighbor who heard sounds she could not confirm were gunshots. No murder weapon. No confession. No witness who placed David at the scene. So they decided to try a different man entirely. Not David Camm the father. Not David Camm the former trooper. They put David Camm the unfaithful husband on trial and made sure the jury despised him long before closing arguments ever began. 12 women took that witness stand. One by one they described affairs, inappropriate propositions, secret relationships stretching back through David's entire career as a state trooper. The prosecution's argument was that David was so desperate to escape his marriage, so consumed by the weight of his double life, that he killed his family to finally get free. David's brother Donnie sat in that courtroom and said what many people were thinking. If he wanted to leave he could have just walked out the door. He had already done it once. He had already left Kim, moved out, moved in with someone else, made his choice, and then came back entirely of his own accord. The idea that a man who voluntarily returned to his marriage then murdered his entire family to escape it required a logic that simply did not hold together under any honest pressure. But juries do not always decide on logic. They decide on feeling. And the feeling in that courtroom after 12 women testified about the man sitting in the defendant's chair was not good for David Camm. Then came the medical examiner's testimony about Jill. The prosecution did not use it as medical evidence. They used it as a grenade. They threw it into that jury box and let it detonate. No charges were ever filed in connection with it. No evidence was ever produced proving David was responsible. It was an unthinkable allegation directed at a grieving parent with nothing concrete beneath it. And the prosecution knew exactly what they were doing with it. Their forensic case rested almost entirely on Robert Stites. Prosecutor Stan Faith stood in that courtroom and repeatedly called him professor. He presented Stites as a credentialed expert, a PhD candidate, a crime scene reconstructionist, a man with deep and serious experience in blood pattern analysis. Every single word of that introduction was a lie and Faith knew it. Stites was a photographer. Rod Engert's photographer. He had never independently processed a murder scene before the night he walked into David Camm's garage. He had no degree, no PhD, no formal training in blood spatter analysis of any kind. The title professor was a complete fabrication constructed for one purpose alone, to make a jury trust a man who had no business being in that courtroom as an expert witness. And yet there he was, testifying with complete confidence that 8 microscopic drops on a basketball shirt proved a father had stood within 4 feet of his own family and pulled a trigger. A man who had never processed a crime scene in his life was now the primary reason another man was going to spend 195 years in a cell. The defense brought their own expert, a bloodstain analyst with more than 30 years of legitimate experience. He testified that those 8 drops were entirely consistent with transfer. When David leaned over Jill's body to reach Bradley in the back seat, his shirt would have brushed against the blood on her hair and arms. 8 drops exactly like those. He demonstrated it in the courtroom with a wig and stage blood. He also pointed out something Stites had conveniently ignored. A real gunshot at close range does not produce 8 drops of blood. It produces hundreds, possibly thousands. If David had fired a weapon within 4 feet of his daughter, he would not have had 8 spots on his shirt. He would have been covered from collar to hem. The jury heard both arguments. They chose to believe the photographer with the fabricated credentials and the borrowed title. The prosecution also had a phone record they believed proved David had lied about his alibi. Records showed a call made from David's home landline at 7:19 in the evening, right around the time Kim and the children would have been arriving home. This contradicted David's claim that he had gone straight to basketball and had not been home at all. But here is the detail that should have ended that theory before it ever reached a jury. Indiana is one of the only states in the country that operates across 2 time zones. David's home was in one zone. The phone company's computers were calibrated to another. A Verizon technician testified that the call had actually been made at 6:19 in the evening, a full hour earlier, before David had even left for basketball. The 7:19 timestamp was a data error caused by a time zone discrepancy. Nothing more. The prosecution treated it like a footnote and moved on as if the technician had never spoken. Marcy Mloud, a friend of Kim, took the stand and delivered the line that may have sealed David's fate more than anything else in that courtroom. She testified that in one of her last conversations with Kim, Kim had told her that history was repeating itself. The implication was clear. Kim had suspected David was back to his old ways. It was a chilling line. And in that courtroom already saturated with the testimony of 12 women, it landed like a verdict before the verdict. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days means there was doubt in that room. It means at least some of those 12 people looked at the evidence and hesitated. For 3 days David waited for the truth to win. It did not. On March 17, 2002, the jury found David Kim guilty of 3 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 195 years in prison. His family erupted. Kim's parents sat quietly. The cameras got everything. 2.5 years later, in August of 2004, the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned the conviction. The ruling was direct and precise. The testimony from those 12 women was inadmissible. It had no legitimate connection to the murders. Its only function had been to make the jury despise David Kim, and it had worked exactly as intended. That alone was enough to throw out the conviction entirely. David was granted a $20,000 bond. His uncle Sam walked straight to the bank, withdrew the cash, and had him out within hours. A new prosecutor named Keith Henderson took over. He promised fresh eyes and a clean start. His team quietly pulled an old piece of evidence from storage. A cardboard box that had been sitting in that evidence locker since the night of the murders. Inside was a gray sweatshirt. Ignored for 5 years. Dusty and forgotten in the dark. Found tucked underneath Bradley's body on the night of September 28. 2 unidentified DNA profiles on that sweatshirt, 1 male and 1 female, neither matching David, neither matching any member of the Kim family, and a handwritten name on the inside of the collar that nobody had ever bothered to trace. The prosecution had assured the defense that the DNA had already been checked against Cody's, the FBI's national database of convicted offenders, and that nothing had come back. That was a lie. The DNA had never been tested. Not before the first trial. Not during it. Not in the 4 years that followed. When the defense demanded the test finally be run, the prosecution refused. They refused until a judge issued a court order forcing compliance. Sit with that for a moment. A prosecution team holding a convicted man who maintained his innocence every single day actively fought against testing the only unidentified DNA found at the scene of a triple murder. They did not want to know what was on that sweatshirt. Or perhaps more accurately, they already suspected what was on it and did not want anyone else to know. The result came back almost immediately. The match was instant. Clean. Unambiguous. The male DNA on that sweatshirt belonged to Charles Darnell Boney. A convicted felon already in the system, already in Cody's, already flagged, already waiting. He had been sitting in that database the entire time while David Cam sat in a prison cell losing year after year of his life. But the DNA was not even the most staggering detail. Look more carefully at what that sweatshirt actually was. It was a prison-issue garment, the kind the Indiana Department of Corrections distributes to inmates. It had Boney's DNA on it. His girlfriend's DNA on it. And the word backbone written on the inside collar in black ink alongside his Department of Corrections identification number. His nickname. His prison ID. His DNA. All three on a single item left at a triple murder scene. That sweatshirt was not just evidence. It was a signed confession that had been sitting in a cardboard box for 5 years while the wrong man served time for the crime it described. The systemic failure that allowed it to go untested for that long is not a clerical error. It is not an oversight. It is one of the most documented examples of willful negligence in the history of American criminal justice. So who was Charles Darnell Boney? His record followed a pattern that was deliberate, escalating, and always aimed at women. He attended Indiana University in Bloomington. Over the years the charges accumulated. Robbery. Battery. Armed robbery. Resisting law enforcement. Each crime a little darker than the last. But the one that gave him his permanent name happened when he forced his way into a home and held 3 women at gunpoint. He was not after money. He was not after jewelry. He wanted their shoes. That single act earned him the name that would follow him everywhere for the rest of his life. The Shoe Bandit. Because Boney had a foot fetish. Not a passing interest. A deep, consuming, driving obsession with women's feet that shaped his crimes with a consistency investigators would recognize immediately once they finally started looking in the right direction. Some of his previous victims reported receiving strange phone calls in the weeks before he attacked them. A man's voice asking what they were wearing. Asking if they had heels on. Building toward something. He was sentenced to 20 years for the home invasion. He served less than 10. Charles Boney walked out on parole on June 19, 2000. The Cam family was murdered on September 28, 2000. 91 days apart. Now go back to that garage. Back to the one detail that had made no sense from the very first night. Kim's shoes removed from her feet and placed on top of the Bronco. Side by side. Toes pointing outward. Arranged with care and deliberate intention in the middle of a scene where 3 people had just been shot to death. And Kim's feet, both of them, had bruising and abrasions across the tops. Injuries the original investigation had never explained, never connected to anything, never pursued. From night one those shoes had been the strangest detail at that crime scene. Investigators knew they mattered. They just had no framework for understanding what kind of person pauses in the aftermath of 3 murders to carefully place a dead woman's shoes on the roof of a car. Now they had their framework. This was not random. This was not incidental. This was signature behavior from a man whose entire criminal history was built around exactly this obsession. The sweatshirt. The shoes. The foot injuries. Every detail that had felt wrong since September 28 suddenly snapped into violent focus around one name. Charles Darnell Boney. On February 17, 2005, police brought him in. He came in relaxed, talkative, almost impossible to stop. Investigators said he just kept going, answering questions nobody had asked yet, filling every silence with explanations that seemed rehearsed but could not quite hold their shape. He admitted the sweatshirt had once been his but said he had donated it to a Salvation Army box months before the murders. Investigators pointed out the problem quietly. A launder-donated shirt would not carry fresh DNA on its collar as if it had been worn recently, as if the collar had been pressed against skin and sweat and living contact. Boney moved past it without hesitation. Then he said the thing that trapped him. He told investigators calmly, confidently, almost conversationally, that his fingerprints could not possibly be at the crime scene. For his prints to appear there, he said, would have had to have been there. He failed his polygraph. They let him go. They said nothing. 2 weeks later, a partial palm print collected from the exterior of Kim's Bronco on the night of the murders, sitting unmatched in the evidence file since 2000, was finally run against Boney's records. Perfect match. The man who had sat across from investigators and told them with calm certainty that his prints could not possibly be at that scene had left his handprint on the car where 2 children were murdered. Charles Boney was arrested on March 4, 2005. That same day David Cam's charges were officially dropped. For exactly 1 hour it was over. Then prosecutors came back with handcuffs and an entirely new theory. David and Boney had conspired together, they said. A clean-cut former state trooper and a convicted shoe bandit with a documented history of escalating violence against women. 2 men from completely different worlds with no phone records connecting them, no financial transactions between them, no witnesses who had ever placed them in the same room at any point in their lives. And the prosecution wanted a jury to believe these 2 men had sat down together and planned a triple murder. This was not about justice anymore. Indiana had spent 5 years publicly calling David Cam a monster. And they were not about to stand in front of a courtroom and admit they had spent those same 5 years letting the real predator walk freely among them. 2 men. 2 courtrooms. 100 miles apart. The same 3 murders. Charles Boney was tried in New Albany. David Cam was tried in Boonville. The state of Indiana needed both of them convicted because if only Boney went down, it meant David was innocent. And if David was innocent, it meant the system had spent 5 years destroying a grieving father while a violent predator lived and breathed and moved through the same communities as the people it was supposed to protect. That was not a story they were willing to tell. Boney went first. After changing his story multiple times during interrogation, first claiming he knew nothing, then claiming he barely knew David, then claiming he had watched everything, he finally settled on a version and delivered it to the jury. He said he had met David at a basketball game in the summer of 2000. He said David had asked him, a convicted felon with a history of violence, whether he could obtain an untraceable gun. He obliged. $250. A 9mm .38 caliber pistol. Then on September 28 he claimed he returned to the Cam house to deliver a second weapon wrapped inside his gray sweatshirt. He said Kim pulled into the garage, David followed her in, and then Boney stood outside and listened to what happened next. He said he heard arguing. Then he heard a number. Then a pop. Then a child's voice saying "Daddy." Then another pop. Then a third. He said David walked back out afterward, pointed the gun at him, and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. And then in what may be the single least believable moment in this entire 13-year saga, Boney claimed that when the gun jammed he chased David back into the garage. Because apparently when a man has just killed his entire family and tried to shoot you, the natural response is to run directly toward him. He said he tripped over Kim's shoes in the confusion, picked them up, and placed them neatly on top of the Bronco. Then he looked inside the car. Then he ran. The jury did not fully believe he was just a witness. The inconsistencies were too visible. Wrong vehicle described. Wrong clothing on David. Details that shifted and bent under pressure. But they believed enough to convict him of participating in the murders. On January 26, 2006, Charles Boney was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 225 years in prison. Now here is where this story reaches a level of irony so dark it almost does not feel real. After his conviction, Boney needed legal representation for his appeals. The attorney he chose was Stan Faith, the original Floyd County prosecutor. The man who had called Stites professor in front of 2 separate juries. The man whose decisions had sent David to prison in the first trial was now representing the man whose DNA had been at the scene the entire time. The same person who built the case against David Camm was now defending the actual convicted killer of Kim, Bradley, and Jill Camm. Nobody in the system blinked. Nobody found this remarkable enough to address. David's second trial began on January 17, 2006. His jury was never told that Charles Boney had just been convicted of these same 3 murders in a courtroom 100 miles away. They were not told about the shoe bandit. Not told about the foot fetish. Not told about the documented history of violent attacks on women, the shoe stealing, the harassing phone calls to victims in the weeks before he struck. The judge ruled it all inadmissible. The jury was deliberately kept in the dark, allowed to hear that Boney's DNA existed at the scene but given no context whatsoever for what kind of man had left it there. They could not see the full picture because the court had covered half of it with a legal blindfold. Keith Henderson had promised a fresh investigation. What he delivered was the same case with a new fictional motive. Since the affairs were permanently gone, the appeals court having sealed that door, Henderson needed something else to explain why David would murder his own family. So he built his entire case around the molestation allegation. His theory was that David had been abusing Jill, that Kim had discovered it, and that David murdered everyone in that garage to prevent it from coming out. There was no physical evidence supporting this. No witness. No medical confirmation. No report from any teacher, doctor, neighbor, or family member who had ever seen or suspected anything in 5 years of Jill's life. The medical examiner herself had said she could not rule out other explanations for what she had found. No abuse charges were ever filed because the evidence to support them simply did not exist. Henderson used it anyway. Not as evidence. As a story. A fictional motive constructed entirely from speculation and aimed with surgical precision at a jury's deepest emotions. Then a documentary crew captured something they were not meant to capture. Henderson, in a private moment with his team, was recorded discussing the 11 alibi witnesses. He said they needed to find a way to break one of them. Not find new evidence. Not follow a new lead. Break a witness. Force a crack in 11 consistent, unwavering, years-long accounts from people who had never once changed a single detail. While David was fighting for his life in a courtroom, his own prosecutor was running a private strategy session on how to manufacture doubt in the people who were simply telling the truth. Then the witnesses started talking about what had happened to them behind closed doors. Lynn Skama Horn was a DNA analyst for the Indiana State Police. During the second trial she took the stand and described something that had happened during the first trial back in 2002. She said that during a recess while she was mid-testimony, prosecutor Stan Faith had pulled her into a private conversation and asked her directly to testify that David Camm's DNA was on Boney's sweatshirt. Her analysis had found no such thing. David's DNA was not on that sweatshirt. Not a trace. She refused to say otherwise. Faith's response, she testified under oath, was to scream at her. He threatened to have her fired. He threatened to charge her with obstruction of justice, a felony that would end her career and potentially her freedom, if she did not say what he wanted her to say. A scientist doing her job correctly was being threatened with destruction for refusing to lie in a murder trial. She wrote a memo about that encounter within days of it happening. That memo still exists. Fingerprint analyst John Singleton came forward with nearly the same story. He testified that Faith had pressured him to soften his certainty about the unidentified palm print on Kim's Bronco, the very print later confirmed as Boney's, to say less than he knew, to soften the certainty, to make the evidence fit the narrative the prosecution had already chosen. 2 forensic analysts. 2 separate threats. One prosecutor systematically trying to reshape physical reality through intimidation of the people paid to find it. And while David was being prosecuted, his prosecutor was negotiating the price of his own story. Keith Henderson had signed a book deal, receiving a $4,000 advance from a publisher to write about the Cam murders while he was actively in the process of trying David for those same murders. Justice was not the goal. A bestseller was the goal. When David's attorneys discovered the book deal, they demanded Henderson be removed from the case immediately. The Indiana Court of Appeals agreed. He was pulled off. A special prosecutor named Stanley Levko was brought in to take what remained of it and start again. On March 3, 2006, before any of that removal happened, the jury found David Cam guilty for the second time. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. In June of 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned it. Their ruling was precise and final. The molestation evidence was speculative, unproven, and had functioned as nothing more than character assassination dressed in the language of motive without a single factual foundation beneath it. David found out the conviction had been overturned by turning on the television inside his cell. Third trial. No affairs. No molestation. Both fictional motives gone. The prosecution had burned through everything they had constructed across 9 years and 3 rounds of trying this man. But they had one card left. They were going to put Charles Boney himself on that witness stand, a man already serving 225 years for these exact murders, and let him point his finger at David Cam one final time. August of 2013. Lebanon, Indiana. David Cam walked into a courtroom for the 3rd time. Same charges. Same grief. But a completely different battlefield. Stanley Levko had inherited a case with nothing left in it. No affairs. No molestation. Both motives that had convicted David twice had been dismantled by appellate courts as speculation dressed in the clothing of evidence. So Levko reached for the only thing remaining on the shelf. Money. He argued that Kim had accumulated approximately $625,000 in life insurance and retirement savings and that David had killed his family to collect it. The defense responded with one quiet observation. David had also taken out life insurance policies on himself. If money was the motive, the logic collapsed in both directions simultaneously. But the prosecution pressed on. What Levko did not know was that this trial was not going to be a rebuttal. It was going to be a detonation. The first explosion came from science. Forensic expert Dr. Richard Eikelenboom took the stand for the defense and testified about touch DNA. Genetic material left behind not through blood but through physical contact alone. Skin cells transferred by grabbing, striking, or struggling with another person during a violent encounter. He had gone back through every piece of evidence in the case and tested for it. Boney's touch DNA was found on Kim's underwear. On Jill's shirt. On Kim's broken fingernail, the kind that snaps off when someone fights back against an attacker with everything they have left. And above a wound on Kim's arm, an abrasion entirely consistent with being grabbed and held down during a struggle. In every version of his story, across 5 different accounts spanning 8 years, Boney had never touched the victims. He had watched from outside. He had only glanced into the car. He had tripped over shoes. He had never laid a hand on Kim or the children. The DNA said he had touched Kim's body in places that told a completely different story about what happened in that garage on the night of September 28. Then Robert Stites walked in. But this time he sat on the defense side of the room. The man Stan Faith had paraded before 2 juries as professor. The blood spatter expert. The PhD candidate. The crime scene reconstructionist whose testimony about 8 microscopic drops of blood had been the single primary reason David Camm was arrested in October of 2000. That man sat in the witness box in 2013 and admitted everything. He was not a professor. He was not a PhD candidate. He was not a crime scene reconstructionist. He was Rod Engert's photographer, sent to a garage he had no training whatsoever to process, handed a role he had no credentials to fill, and given a title that had been manufactured from nothing to make him credible to 2 separate juries. Every title Stan Faith had used to introduce him to those juries was a fabrication. And Faith, Stites now testified, had helped build those fabrications piece by piece. His conclusions about the blood on David's shirt were scientifically baseless guesswork from a man who should never have been in that courtroom in any capacity resembling an expert. A photographer's opinion dressed in borrowed credentials had been the cornerstone of 2 separate murder convictions. And now 13 years later, that same man was sitting in court and dismantling his own testimony brick by brick in front of the people who needed to hear it most. He was never charged with perjury. Then Charles Boney took the stand. He had agreed to testify against David one final time. He came in and delivered his story. The gun. The garage. The shots. The jammed weapon. The shoes. And then a juror asked him a question. In this trial, jurors were permitted to submit questions directly to witnesses, a rare and significant procedure that would prove decisive. One juror wanted to know something simple. Something any genuine eyewitness would know without hesitation, the kind of detail that burns itself into memory when you have just witnessed 3 people being killed. What was David Camm wearing that night? Boney said long pants. David had been wearing basketball shorts. Documented in the original police report on the night of the murders. Confirmed by every single witness from the church gym. The same basketball shorts he had put on before leaving for a Thursday night game he had played every single week for years. The man claiming to have stood outside that garage and watched David murder his entire family could not correctly identify what David was wearing. Under cross-examination, the damage continued. Wrong vehicle described. Wrong details about the scene. Critical facts that any genuine eyewitness would have burned into permanent memory. All of them wrong. Boney's story had never fully held together across any of its 5 versions. But in that courtroom, in front of that jury, in the year 2013, it collapsed entirely in real time. The defense also brought forward what had happened inside the investigation itself from the very beginning. A police officer who had been present on the night of the murders testified in this 3rd trial and admitted under oath that when he arrived at the Camm garage on September 28, before he had examined a single piece of physical evidence, before he had spoken to a single witness, he had already decided it was a David Camm crime scene. A juror said afterward, "We all felt he was looking for evidence to support a conclusion he had already reached. That is not how you investigate a case." The defense also surfaced the story of Myron Wilkinson, a police officer not assigned to the Camm case who happened to be a distant relative of Charles Boney. After Boney's arrest in 2005, Wilkinson met with him privately at the station. 2 months later, investigators discovered Wilkinson had entered the evidence room, removed Kim Camm's phone without signing it out, and taken it to his personal home. When the phone came back, every fingerprint on its surface had been wiped completely clean. Wilkinson died before the 3rd trial began. He was never charged with anything. The jury deliberated for 10 hours. Not because they were unsure. But because this case had 13 years of debris to carefully work through. Fabricated experts. Suppressed DNA. Coached witnesses. Wiped evidence. 5 contradictory versions of one man's account. And a system that had never once genuinely stopped to ask whether it had the right person sitting in the defendant's chair. On October 24, 2013, they came back. Not guilty. David heard those words, and the sound that left him was not a cheer. It was not a shout of relief or a declaration of victory. It was something far older and far more broken than any of that. He wailed. He bent forward at the waist. He stood up. He sat back down. He covered his face with both hands. 13 years. A wrongful conviction. Fighting from inside a prison cell while his children's killer walked free and his children lay in the ground, and the system that was supposed to serve them told the same lie over and over until someone finally stopped letting it. Tom Jolly, the church elder who had sat on that baseline and talked with David during the basketball game on the night of September 28, 2000, had also been there the night David found his family. He knew exactly what David's grief looked like when it was real. He said quietly, "The night I found him at the crime scene he was on the ground wailing and weeping over his family. He wept the same way today, but for joy. Not everyone felt that joy." Kim's parents, Frank and Janice Wren, sat in that courtroom and heard the verdict and could not accept it. Frank said afterward, "Did I hear that right? What went wrong?" To this day they believe David was responsible for their daughter's death. The system did not just fail Kim, Bradley, and Jill on September 28, 2000. It failed them again every year that followed. And in doing so it fractured a family that had already lost everything, driving a permanent divide between people who had once stood on exactly the same side of grief. That is a wound no verdict could ever heal. In 2016 David settled a civil lawsuit against Floyd County for $450,000. In April of 2022, nearly a decade after his acquittal, his final civil action was settled for $4.6 million after the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals ruled he had valid claims for false arrest against Stites, Engert, Faith, and Clemens. During oral arguments in that civil case, a federal judge referenced Star Trek when the Attorney General attempted to explain how David could have simultaneously been at the basketball game and committed the murders. The court was openly dismissive. One justice reportedly laughed. David repaid more than $1 million of that settlement directly to the family members and friends who had funded his defense across 13 years of fighting. He paid them back before he paid himself anything. Today David Kem works as a case coordinator for Investigating Innocence, a nonprofit that provides criminal defense investigations for people who may have been wrongfully imprisoned. A man who lost 13 years to a broken system now spends every working day trying to pull others out of it before it takes 13 years from them too. Charles Boney is still in prison. Still serving 225 years. He still maintains his innocence. On the wall of his cell he keeps a photograph. It is a picture of Kim, Bradley, and Jill Cam. He looks at it every day and only he knows what passes through his mind when he does. 3 people were murdered in a garage in Georgetown, Indiana on September 28, 2000. Kim was 35 years old. Bradley was 7. Jill was 5. They were not a case number. They were not a headline. They were a mother who had finally, after everything she had survived, gotten her white picket fence. A little boy who felt warm to his father's touch for a few final minutes on a concrete floor. A little girl who never even had the chance to unbuckle her seatbelt. They deserved justice from the very first night. What they got instead was 13 years of a system that confused conviction with truth. That buried a DNA match in an untested cardboard box. That threatened scientists into silence. That built 2 murder convictions on a photographer's guesswork and borrowed credentials. That coached witnesses, wiped fingerprints off evidence, signed book deals, and kept trying the same grieving man 3 times across 13 years rather than stand in a room and admit that it had been catastrophically, permanently, irreversibly wrong from the very beginning. The truth did not win easily. But on October 24, 2013, it finally won. If you are still here, 3 questions before you go. Do you believe the prosecution genuinely thought David was guilty, or was this 13 years of institutional pride refusing to admit a mistake that had already destroyed enough lives? Charles Boney gave 5 different versions of what happened that night in that garage. Which parts, if any, do you believe are true? And if that gray sweatshirt had been tested on October 2, 2000, the day after David's arrest, when the name on the collar was fresh and the case was still open and the real killer had nowhere to hide, how different would every single life in this story have been? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe to Midnight Crime 247 if this case stayed with you. And turn on notifications because the next one is already waiting in the dark.